Kalam podcast is made possible through listeners like you. If you enjoy listening to Kalam, please subscribe to the show in whatever podcast application you're listening to right now, and please give us a rating. It helps other people find out about us. And if you'd like to support the show with a small donation, consider signing up to Kalam Podcast on Patreon for just $3 a month. In addition to supporting the show, you'll gain access to lots of great bonus content. Go to patreon.com and search for Kalam Podcast, or go straight to patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. That's patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. Now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to the 16th installment of Kalam Digest, Kalam Podcast's weekly news summary. I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Sam Carl Samra. Welcome to the show, Sam.
Thank you, Edgar.
Today we have three stories on the docket. The latest about the ceasefire in Lebanon, the latest on the horrific war in Gaza, and of course our main story, which is going to focus on the dramatic events in Syria, specifically northern Syria, the retaking of the city of Aleppo, Halab, by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, which we'll be calling HTS in this show. I'll explain what that name means later in the program. But Sam, let's talk about the ceasefire in Lebanon, the kind of fragile ceasefire, if we want to believe media reports, if we want to believe the U.S. government. Very stable. So what's going on here? Who broke the ceasefire? Is it really broken? Is there a ceasefire? Let us know.
Well, as we discussed last week, Israel, to start out with the ceasefire negotiations, Israel wanted to retain the right to unilaterally attack Lebanese territory, Lebanon in general. Even though there was supposed to be a ceasefire, they wanted a ceasefire which gave them the right to attack Lebanon. And of course, that is not a viable ceasefire. It's not what you would call a ceasefire in any normal usage of the term. But they backed down from that because they seemed somewhat desperate to get out of Lebanon. But since the ceasefire started, I think, is it 6 days ago? Today, they have taken it in their own hands to do that anyway. So they've been attacking Lebanon basically since day one of the ceasefire. They've been striking targets deep inside Lebanon and even more so in the south. So this has been ongoing for a while. Hezbollah did not strike back for a long time, but yesterday they struck the Sheba farms, occupied Lebanese territory, occupied by Israel, and Israel immediately called this a grave mistake. They will retaliate, etc. And they did. So in the last 24 hours, 11 people have been killed in Lebanon in intensified Israeli strikes. So is there even a ceasefire in place? As you just mentioned, the US specifically and France, who are the two guarantors of the ceasefire, have claimed that, yes, there's a ceasefire, there is no war going on, etc. We should give this time. Yeah. And France has come out and criticized Israel actually for carrying out attacks on Lebanon. But it kind of depends on what we mean. There's not a cessation of hostilities, obviously. There's a ceasefire, of course, in the sense that the number and extent of the attacks have gone down dramatically since before the ceasefire was declared. But will it hold? That is, I guess, the major question.
Yes, indeed.
We don't know.
Yeah, we'll have to keep following these developments. Hopefully next week we can report on 0 deaths because cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire, meaning that the fire has ceased, would mean that not 11 people would be killed in Lebanon. Hopefully that will take effect next week. But for now, we'll table that there. Let's move on to our next story in Gaza. What is the latest on the horrific war, the genocide, the complete human abyss, which is Gaza today?
Nothing new, sadly, which means it's ongoing. There were strikes overnight in the north of Gaza, with many dozens people killed. It's still not clear, but it seems a number of residential buildings have been destroyed, etc., and also people killed in the major hospital in the north. I saw from the other day, the head of the major remaining hospital was killed in an Israeli strike. Also, some people may have seen, what's his name again? Mahmoud Madhoun, I think. Man made famous for arranging one of the few functioning soup kitchens, basically, in Gaza, which had been feeding thousands of people every day, was killed in a targeted drone strike by the Israelis. So, yeah, we've been through this many times before, and what we can say is basically nothing changes, which means everything is ongoing, devastation, killing, etc. And I think it's another thing that's important to mention is Israel seems to have intensified its attacks in the West Bank. Overnight, a number of people were arrested, some people were killed. This, of course, has also been ongoing since October last year, but perhaps of some importance is that the deputy secretary of Fatah, i.e., the main opponent of Hamas, supposedly the war is on Hamas, as we all know, but this is a major opponent force opposing Hamas and the force ruling the West Bank, supposedly. His name is Majid Abu Akar, was arrested by the Israelis, or kidnapped, if you want to use the preferred terminology of Israel, overnight. And we have not seen any response from Fatah so far, but they seem to be ramping up the repression in the West Bank.
Yeah. Well, nothing quite on either of those fronts. Yeah, over a year into this, and the devastation is on more or less the same level. It seems absolutely insane. But it seems to be ongoing. The talks have completely fallen through, right? Is there any talk of a ceasefire in Gaza?
It doesn't seem like there's anything viable on the table at the moment, but Egypt and Qatar, and I think even the US overnight mentioned something about renewed talks. And Hamas has, of course, as they do almost every week now, renewed their, or again stated that they accept a ceasefire proposal along the lines negotiated in May and June of this year, which means something pretty similar to the ceasefire supposedly in place in Lebanon, where Israel would step by step withdraw from Gaza in exchange for release of hostages from Hamas, and also release of hostages from Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. But no, you're right. It doesn't seem to be anything close to actually being a specific, clear deal put on the table for negotiations.
Okay, let's move on to our main story, which is kind of like a ripple effect of the insanity we've been seeing the past year since the 7th of October, the operations, the genocide in Gaza, the military operations, and the invasion of Lebanon, the attempted invasion. As soon as the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hezbollah took effect, it seems that several groups, military groups in Syria, who haven't really been, Syria has been kind of a Cold War for the past few months, maybe even the past few years, and very much ignored by the Western press. I get it, in a way, it's hard to keep covering something that is so kind of low intensity, but still, destroying people's lives on a daily basis. Several armed groups, spearheaded by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, launched an attack against the city of Aleppo, one of the larger cities in Syria in the north, I think the second largest city after Damascus, and retook it, it seems now. Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, used to be a kind of al-Qaeda, Daesh-affiliated Islamist organization. Now they've seemed to have cut ties, at least politically, and maybe somewhat ideologically, with al-Qaeda and the Daesh kind of like branch of jihadist extremism. Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham. Hay'a means so kind of like organization. It's a very administrative word in Arabic. It means like personnel. And Tahrir al-Sham means the liberation of Syria. So it is kind of a weird name. That's why it's called HTS English. I think we should continue to refer to them as HTS. But then they and various other sort of rebel groups that oppose the Bashar al Assad regime managed to retake Syria. Sam, what the hell is going on? What does this mean? Please tell us.
Yeah, well, just two tiny corrections. You said Syria. They managed to retake Halab, Aleppo, of course. So they're still moving pretty close to their little enclave, Idlib, where they have been had power for since 2017. I think this specific movement has been kind of the main opposition group controlling that area, which has not been retaken at any point since 2011 by government forces. But they broke out of that enclave. And they managed to retake Halab, which is, as far as I know, actually the biggest city of Syria. It's usually, at least historically, before the war, it used to be bigger than Damascus in terms of population. But so what's going on is really difficult to say. What we know is that Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, as you said, is an outgrowth of Jabhat al-Nusra, the old Al-Qaeda affiliated movement. They renamed themselves a committee, is what I would normally translate Hayat.
Yes.
But they are basically an umbrella organization for jihadist Sunni fighters. The background is very complicated, but I would say that obviously it's related to the war that's going on in Lebanon and Palestine. One aspect of it is that the Assad regime has been propped out by Russia, by Iran, by Hezbollah, since they managed to kind of turn the tide in the civil war in 2014. The Assad regime has still not managed to kind of rebuild or consolidate itself. It seems very weak on the inside, but it has not been seriously questioned or attacked by any opposition forces for a long time now. There's been a ceasefire in place between the opposition forces in Idlib and the regime since 2020, negotiated between Turkey and Russia, basically. So these are, let's not say all out Turkish backed, because Turkey is very skeptical as well of these groups, because they are, even though Turkey is of course ruled by an Islamist party, but these groups are perceived to be like, far too jihadist for Erdogan's taste. But it seems very clear they couldn't have managed to rebuild their strength as much as they have without tacit support, or at least acceptance from Turkey.
Yeah.
It, of course, is on the Turkish border. So, as long as that border crossing is open, they are managing to have their own little mini state of their own. There, you used to mention that 4 million people live in Idlib, so it's not tiny. So it's a lot of people, and a lot of refugees, of course, from the rest of Syria. BBC reported on this just the other day, that if you look back to 2017, far more people have fled from regime-controlled Syria to the opposition enclaves than the other way around.
Yeah.
This is a very complex, even though it's been a Cold War, it's been a very complex, ongoing kind of civil strife inside Syria. But so I would say then that the specific reason is that the Assad regime is not strong in itself, and this seems very clear from this. I mean, they lost control of the biggest, or perhaps second biggest city of Syria, in just a couple of days. And this just goes to show that the regime in itself doesn't have the forces to kind of control its own lands. And of course, Russia is very preoccupied with Ukraine. They're also very preoccupied with, in general, trying to kind of prop up their own regime on the home front. Iran is somewhat weakened and has been focusing on Lebanon for a long time, of course. But most importantly, Hezbollah, which was probably the main fighting force on the ground in the Syrian civil war on the side of Assad, has been forced to kind of refocus on its home turf in Lebanon. It's been weakened severely, of course, by the Patriot attacks and also some other, the aerial bombardments of Israel. But more importantly than that, I think they've had to refocus their political kind of energies on rebuilding and consolidating its position in Lebanon. And this just goes to show that when they kind of move out, the regime is very fragile.
Do you think that in terms of Israel, they've been speaking about wanting to redraw the map of the Middle East, almost at the beginning of this conflict, or the beginning of the October 7 attack and the huge retaliation by Israel. I mean, do you think that this plays into their understanding of like what they want to do, or is this like just a random ripple effect, and they might be able to like spin it as something that benefits them? What do you think?
And I mean, as expected, Hezbollah and pro-Assad forces in general have already begun spinning this as, the HTS is kind of a stooge of Israel. They're
Yeah.
Israel-backed militia. There's no sign at all that there is an actual Israeli support for HTS. I haven't seen any serious sources even trying to claim that there will be such a thing as Israeli support for jihadists in Syria. But on the other hand, of course, to the extent that there's infighting on the other side, if we talk about the rest of the Middle East as the other side from Israel, it benefits Israel, of course. Of course it does, and even more so if Hezbollah is forced to refocus again back to Syria, that would be very beneficial to Israel. But on the other hand, let's not forget that the Assad regime has been in power since 1970, basically. First Père and then the son, Assad.
Mhm.
And they have, throughout that entire period, they have posed zero threat to Israel. A lot of, or at least some pro-Palestinian people are prone to seeing them as kind of part of this axis of resistance, but apart from letting Iran perhaps use their airports, etc., for infrastructure. They have not, made any attempts to even threaten Israel's security. They've even, moved in to crush anti-Israeli movements, including the PLO, to make sure that Israel doesn't invade Lebanon, for example, in 1977. So, there's no reason to think that Israel would, in the long run, benefit from Assad falling. The Assad regime is a very convenient solution for Israel. And, a very hypothetical, that's very far away still, Islamist regime run by the HTS or something similar would be, a much graver threat to Israel, of course. So we talked about on this podcast many times. The Israeli, the Arab public is much more actively anti-Israeli and pro-Palestinian than any regime
Yeah.
on the table.
But of course, if you take it at face value, Israel's stated goal is to weaken the axis of resistance spearheaded by Iran. And obviously, the Assad regime is an Iranian proxy at this point. It hasn't always been, but it is very much aligned with the Iranian sort of axis, and Hezbollah aligned with them. Getting that out of the way, if we would believe Israel's stated goal, is still an objective to be achieved, right?
Yeah, I would say that the best outcome for Israel would, of course, be even more, more internal fracturing of Syria. That's always great for them. Infighting on the other side is good, but I would say, so in that sense, of course, anything that weakens the Syrian regime is good for Israel in the short term. And as you just mentioned, it's been the connection between Syria and Iran is very, very strong. This is based partly on Shiite kind of solidarity between Alawis and which the Assad family and their allies belong to in Syria, and Iran's 12 Shiite Khomeinist government. But there's also just a basic fact they started out being the two main opponents of Iraq back in the day. They allied over that. They were strongly anti-Iraq, and now Iraq, on the other hand, has a Shiite or more, let's not say pro-Irani, but more Iran positive government. So that's changed from the days of Saddam, when it was a Sunni Arab nationalist anti-Iran state. But so what might happen that might be, detrimental to the connection between Iran and Syria would be if the Syrian regime fell and it was replaced by some hardcore Sunni government, which would, break ties with Iran, for example. This is hard to say. The HTS let's not have any kind of rose-tinted glasses here and think that they are just kind of a liberation army fighting for, the freedom and democracy. But on the other hand, what's been going on around the liberation, quote unquote, of Halab seems to point in the direction that they are strategically or tactically, at least, clearly less radical than Al Qaeda or the ISIS. They seem to have doesn't seem to have been any kind of major attacks on Christians or Alawis in Halab since they took over. There's even been, interviews circulating of like Christians saying like these guys are fine, we just want peace and quiet and we hate the regime. We're not Islamists, we're Christians, but they seem to be doing okay. Well, let's not take that as at face value. Of course, we don't know really what's going on the ground, but we would have heard if there had been like major sectarian attacks or outbreaks of generalized attacks on Christians, for example, in Halab, a city with some Christian population and some Alawi population as well. So it might be that HTS are actually trying to reframe themselves as more of a kind of Muslim Brotherhood style. Sunni, of course, but not like vehemently sectarian Sunni movement. And if that's the case, they are still, of course, they are, as all the other movements involved here, they are strongly anti-Israel. So, I mean, it's not necessarily the case that even if they made major inroads, they would break off ties with Iran. And we also have, of course, on the geopolitical major scale, we have the which we talked about before, the major shift in the geopolitics of the region since 7th of October has been or something that was ongoing even before that, actually, the nearing of Iran and the Saudi-led Gulf Cooperation Council. So the Sunni Gulf Arab states and Iran have been moving closer to each other. This is, of course, far too early to say anything about, but it seems to me that the major split around Syria, which was between, Gulf states on the one hand, which wanted to bring down Assad, and Iran on the other hand, which tried to prop him up. If that is a thing of the past to some extent, you might even reach an agreement or some kind of solution to this crisis, which along the lines of kind of holding some kind of talks or something to overcome the war in Syria. Because I don't think anyone besides the HTS themselves basically wants an all-out Syrian civil war again. It's not beneficial to anyone except Israel and the HTS.
Well, Sam, my friend, I admire your ability to find a kind of like positive spin on these crazy developments. We'll have to keep following them. It's so fresh, it's so new. We know nothing essentially, but let's wrap it there. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining me on this 16th installment of Kalam Digest on the 3rd of December 2024. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agar.